Hello, listener. It's time to dive into the Juniverse, where tales of infidelity, betrayal, and heart-wrenching confessions pull you into the vast unknown.
Matthew and Claire's marriage had always been a picture of suburban contentment, a carefully constructed life of shared responsibilities and mutual respect. Their home, a spacious two-story in a quiet cul-de-sac, had become their sanctuary, a place where they could escape the world's pressures, build memories with their children, and grow old together. But like a house of cards, something began to shift beneath the surface, threatening to bring it all crashing down. It all seemed so perfect. The two kids, Liam, their energetic 6-year-old boy, and Sophie, their curious and sweet 3-year-old girl, laughing as they ran through the house, their giggles filling the rooms. Matthew, the hard-working executive, was always the first to leave for work, ready to tackle the challenges of a fast-paced tech company. Claire, ever the devoted wife, always saw the kids off with a kiss before setting off on her own daily routine, balancing work and home with grace. They were partners, in every sense of the word. But that balance had started to crumble. Matthew first noticed it on a Tuesday morning. Claire's routine had subtly changed. Instead of her usual upbeat morning greeting, she was distracted, eyes fixed on her phone, and her smile seemed strained. When Matthew asked her about it, she quickly brushed it off, claiming it was nothing more than a stressful day at work. But there was something in the way she said it, too quick, too dismissive, that made Matthew pause. As the days passed, the cracks grew wider. Claire had recently befriended a new coworker, Tara, a sharp-witted, charming woman who worked in the accounting department of Claire's firm. They had clicked instantly, their personalities complementing one another in a way that seemed almost effortless. Matthew noticed that their interactions weren't confined to the office anymore. They were meeting outside work, drinks after hours, spontaneous dinner parties, late-night texts. It was during one of those evenings when Matthew's unease reached a breaking point. Matthew came home late one night after a particularly grueling day at work. He walked through the door, greeted by the sound of the TV playing faintly in the background, and the scent of Claire's perfume lingering in the air. But something felt off. The house was too quiet. He called out to Claire, but there was no answer. The kids were already in bed, as expected. He found Claire in the kitchen, staring at her phone with a look that Matthew could only describe as vacant. "Hey," he said softly, trying to catch her attention. "How was your day?" Claire snapped out of her trance, a smile quickly forming on her lips, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, just a long meeting with Tara. She's been stressing over a new project. And I guess we lost track of time." Matthew raised an eyebrow. Tara again. It wasn't unusual for Claire to have work meetings that ran late, but her responses felt rehearsed, too perfect. The lipstick that Claire wore, usually pristine, had smudged slightly at the corners of her lips. It was a minor detail, but to Matthew, it felt like a glaring red flag. Before he could speak, Claire shifted nervously. "I'm going to hop in the shower. I feel gross after all the talking. You know how it is with Tara's constant chain smoking," she said, trying to downplay her agitation. Matthew stood in the kitchen, his hands clenched tightly around the edge of the counter. Something was wrong. This wasn't the Claire he knew. The distance, the rushed explanations, the smudged lipstick, it all added up in his mind, though he refused to admit it at first. The nagging doubt in the pit of his stomach couldn't be ignored any longer. Claire disappeared into the bathroom, and Matthew found himself rooted to the spot, his thoughts racing. Could it be possible? Could his wife, his partner for 10 years, be hiding something from him? Matthew's suspicion lingered, and the following days felt like a slow-motion unraveling of everything he thought he knew. Claire's behavior became more erratic. She started working later, coming home closer to midnight, her phone buzzing more frequently, her excuses wearing thinner with each passing day. One afternoon, he made the decision to act. He had to know the truth. Matthew had planned to attend a weekend barbecue at Tara and her husband's house. It was meant to be a casual get-together, but Matthew had a different agenda. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and he intended to find out what. The barbecue was in full swing when Matthew arrived. The children were inside, glued to the TV, while the adults lounged outside, chatting over drinks. Tara was hosting, looking effortlessly chic as she mingled with the guests. But it was her husband, Ryan, who would prove to be the catalyst for Matthew's awakening. Ryan, drunk and slurring his words, pulled Matthew aside for a conversation that Matthew would never forget. As they stood on the back porch, Ryan stumbled slightly before leaning in and speaking with a laugh that barely disguised his discomfort. "You know," Ryan began, his words slow and slurred, "I never thought you'd be the type, but I guess it doesn't matter in the end. You put up with it, don't you?" Matthew's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to mask the rising panic in his chest. "Claire," Ryan continued, barely able to keep his eyes open, "she's been going out with Tara, right? You know what they're doing, don't you? I've seen it before. All those late nights, all those secret glances. I know my wife isn't the only one. It's a whole world you don't see." Matthew felt the ground shift beneath him. His breath hitched in his chest as the pieces finally fell into place. Tara wasn't just Claire's coworker. She was the key to a web of lies that Matthew had failed to see until now. Ryan's drunken confession haunted Matthew as he made his way home that night, his mind spinning. Claire's secrets were no longer hidden in the shadows. They were right in front of him. The world he thought he knew was starting to fracture, and all that was left was to confront it. Matthew knew it was time. He couldn't pretend anymore. That night, as Claire came in late from yet another meeting with Tara, Matthew was waiting. He was done with the questions, the doubts, and the half-truths. He needed answers. "Claire," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with an unmistakable edge. "Where were you tonight?" Claire froze at the door. She had expected a simple question, not the cold intensity Matthew was now radiating. She took a step back, her posture defensive. "I told you, I was with Tara." Matthew shook his head slowly, a bitter smile forming on his lips. "I'm not talking about Tara. I'm talking about everything else." Claire's eyes darted to the side, avoiding his gaze. "What are you implying?" she asked, her voice rising slightly, a note of panic creeping in. Matthew stepped closer, his eyes locked onto hers. "I know what's been going on. You can stop pretending, Claire. It's over." Claire let out a short, harsh laugh. "You think you can just walk in here and accuse me of something without knowing the whole story?" She crossed her arms, her stance defensive. "You have no idea what's been happening. You never did." With those words, Claire's walls came down. What followed was a brutal confrontation, the truth laid bare in all its ugly glory. Claire confessed to the affair, not just one, but many. And as the dam broke, Matthew realized that the woman he had built a life with was someone entirely different than he had thought. It was in that moment, standing in the wreckage of their marriage, that Matthew made a decision. It was time to take control of his life, and he would no longer let Claire's betrayals define him. The game had changed, and now, he was the one who would set the rules. Matthew was doing his best to maintain composure, but inside, a storm was brewing. The barbecue had started off as a casual gathering, a chance for the families to reconnect and let the kids play. But Daniel, already drunk after a few too many beers, had unintentionally thrown gasoline on a fire that Matthew was only beginning to recognize. Daniel's words echoed in Matthew's mind. The casual mention of his wife, Claire, and her late nights with Tara, every week now, without fail. The kids were laughing inside, oblivious to the tension growing in the backyard. But Matthew could feel his pulse thumping in his ears. He glanced across the yard, where Claire was laughing with Tara, her eyes bright and carefree, as if there was nothing wrong in the world. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Matthew's mind raced, his thoughts colliding like a wrecking ball. He had been blind, so focused on their family, their kids, and the picture-perfect life they'd created, that he hadn't seen the cracks forming right before his eyes. "What do you mean?" Matthew's voice barely caught in his throat as he leaned in, hoping for some sort of explanation, something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Daniel's eyes glazed over as he took another swig from his beer. His words were thick with alcohol, but there was a strange, almost eerie clarity to them. "I mean, I see it. I see what's going on when Tara comes home late, smelling like perfume and smoke, and I know she's been with Claire. Sometimes, I think it's all about the thrill. But man, you have no idea. You think they're just out at bars or whatever. Nah, there's more to it." Matthew's stomach clenched. His throat was dry. His hands clenched so tightly around his drink that his knuckles turned white. He forced himself to stay calm, to hear it out. What do you think they're doing?" Daniel paused for a moment, glancing around nervously, as if afraid of saying too much. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper, as if the words he was about to speak were something unspeakable. "They're getting into things, man. Things I'm not even sure you'd want to know. Not just a little fun. It's darker than that. Matthew's blood ran cold. The words hung in the air, thick with implications he wasn't sure he wanted to explore. His heart raced, the quiet hum of the barbecue around him fading into the background as his mind swirled with possibilities, none of which were good. "Daniel, stop," Matthew said, his voice firm, a little desperate. He wasn't ready to hear more, but his curiosity, no, his need to understand, was driving him forward. "What the hell are you talking about? Are you saying?" "I'm saying that whatever you think is going on, it's not. There's more. A lot more. I've seen the bruises on Tara. Heard the stories from some of the other guys. It's not just a little girl's night out. They're into something else, something you wouldn't get unless you were in it." Matthew's head was spinning. Could this be true? His wife, the mother of his children, involved in something sordid, something he couldn't even fathom? His entire world felt like it was shifting under his feet. "You're lying," Matthew whispered under his breath, shaking his head. He couldn't bring himself to believe it, but his gut told him something was horribly wrong. His heart pounded in his chest, and a creeping dread settled deep in his bones. Daniel wasn't finished. His eyes were unfocused, but there was a dark kind of knowing in them. "You think you're the only one who's been fooled? I've been living in this mess for years. Tara comes home, all smiles, acting like nothing's wrong, but I know what's really happening. You're not the only one being played here, Matthew." Daniel's words cut deeper than any accusation Claire had ever made. Matthew felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. He wanted to stand up, to storm away and pretend he hadn't heard a word. But he couldn't. He was trapped. His mind raced, replaying every moment with Claire, the long hours at work, the strange behavior, the secretive phone calls, and the reality hit him like a freight train. "I think you know what's going on," Daniel continued, his words slurring more as he finished his beer. "You just don't want to admit it. But you will, soon enough. You'll see her for what she really is. And when you do, don't say I didn't warn you." Matthew could feel the blood drain from his face. The man in front of him, once just a casual acquaintance, had just planted a seed of doubt in his mind, one that was growing, spreading like a wildfire. The images in his head, of Claire, of Tara, of what could possibly be happening, began to form. What was his wife truly capable of? "Matthew, trust me," Daniel mumbled, his head leaning back against the wooden deck. "You'll regret not listening to me. But it's not too late. You're still her husband, right? You can still take control." Matthew didn't respond. He couldn't. He stood there, frozen, as the words hung in the air like a heavy fog. The following days were torture for Matthew. Every time he looked at Claire, he felt like a stranger was staring back at him. Her smile no longer felt genuine, her laughter no longer warm. Every time she left the house, he wondered what she was doing. Every time she came home late, his stomach twisted in knots. His mind couldn't stop racing, the words Daniel had whispered echoing over and over again. "You'll see her for what she really is." But Matthew wasn't ready to face that truth, at least, not yet. He didn't know how. He was still trying to come to terms with the idea that his wife, the woman he thought he knew, had been living a life so far removed from what he believed. But one thing was certain, he needed answers. And he would stop at nothing to get them. The days stretched on like an endless loop for Matthew. His once peaceful home now felt suffocating. The walls closing in as he watched Claire with a growing sense of dread. The signs were impossible to ignore now. She continued to come home late. Her excuses, once simple and unremarkable, now growing more forced, more hollow. "I was at Tara's," Claire would say, brushing past him with a quick kiss on the cheek. "Work's been crazy." But Matthew wasn't blind. He had heard these same words too many times, too easily spoken. He could see the lie in her eyes, feel the distance between them growing wider with every passing day. The cracks in their marriage, once small and barely noticeable, had widened into jagged chasms, and Matthew couldn't pretend anymore. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had built a life with, had become a stranger. But it wasn't until that particular Wednesday night that Matthew decided to take control. He couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine. The weight of the suspicion had become unbearable, and the emotional turmoil had eaten away at him. He needed answers. After the kids had gone to bed, Matthew stayed awake, waiting in the darkened living room, his heart thundering in his chest. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, each passing second amplifying the growing anxiety that gnawed at him. And then, the front door creaked open, the sound sharp and final in the stillness of the night. Claire stepped inside, her face flushed, her steps unsteady. She looked like she had been rushing. Her clothes slightly disheveled, the perfume that once smelled fresh now pungent and heavy in the air. It wasn't just the lateness that unsettled him. It was the look on her face, as if she was hiding something more than just the hour. Matthew didn't even wait for her to take off her coat. "Where were you?" His voice was steady, but the tension hung between them like a thick fog. Claire froze at the door, her eyes widening with a flicker of panic. Then, she quickly composed herself, brushing past him with the same practiced indifference. "I was just with Tara," she replied, her voice too casual, too rehearsed. "Having a late drink. Work's been crazy." Matthew's gaze hardened as he watched her, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten. "You were with Tara? Again?" Claire's expression flickered for a second, irritation creeping in. She tossed her bag onto the couch, turning to face him with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Matthew, please, don't start this again," she snapped, her tone defensive. "It's not what you think." Matthew's jaw clenched. "Then tell me the truth, Claire," he demanded, his voice low but unyielding. "What's really going on? Because I can't keep pretending I don't see what's happening." For a moment, Claire didn't answer. She stood there, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The truth had already been laid bare, and Matthew could see it in the way she avoided his gaze, in the way her body language shifted. That's when she turned to him, slowly, deliberately, a sly smile curling at the corners of her lips. It wasn't the smile of the woman he had married, the woman he had loved. No, this was something darker, something crueler. "You really want to know?" Claire's voice dropped, low and almost taunting. She took a step closer to him, her eyes glinting with something that Matthew couldn't place, something cold. "I'm having an affair, Matthew," she said, her words clear and final, slicing through the air. "I've been with other men. Men who excite me in ways you never could." Matthew's heart stopped, the air leaving his lungs in a rush. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of him. He had suspected, feared this moment, but hearing it, hearing her confess it out loud, shattered something inside him. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know how to react. His mind raced, but his body was frozen, as if the weight of her betrayal had rendered him incapable of movement. Claire continued, her voice growing colder, more detached. "I don't need to hide it anymore. I'm getting everything I want. And you? You're too afraid to leave me. You'll put up with it because of the kids, the house. You can't walk away from all of this, Matthew." She paused, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and disdain. "You'll stay, because you know that if you leave, you'll lose it all. And you're too weak to do anything about it." Her words sliced through him, each one a knife that twisted deeper. He couldn't speak. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on him. The woman he had given everything to, the woman he had built his life with, was now standing before him, admitting to the worst kind of betrayal. Matthew took a step back, his mind reeling. He couldn't process it all at once. His body was in shock, unable to grasp the full reality of what she had just confessed. She didn't even seem to care, her eyes cold and calculating. Claire stood there, waiting for him to react, her face full of contempt, as though she had already written him off. She had already moved on, emotionally and physically, while Matthew was still stuck in the wreckage of their life together. "What about us, Claire?" Matthew's voice was barely a whisper, the words catching in his throat. "What about everything we've built?" Claire didn't even flinch. She only smirked, the smile never reaching her eyes. "What about us? You think this was ever real?" "It was never about us, Matthew. It was about me. I've been living my life the way I want to, and now you're just going to have to deal with it." The finality of her words hung in the air, suffocating him. Matthew's world crumbled in that moment. The woman he loved, the mother of his children, standing before him with nothing but coldness and cruelty in her eyes. His heart, once full of trust, now lay shattered on the floor at his feet. As Claire walked past him toward the bedroom, her footsteps light and carefree, Matthew stood there, rooted to the spot. He had expected everything except this. His heart ached, but it was more than that now. It was anger, a deep, fiery rage that rose from the pit of his stomach. Claire had broken him, and there was no going back. The lies, the betrayal, the manipulations, she had shattered everything. And Matthew, at that moment, made a decision. The games were over. He would no longer be a passive participant in his own life. He would not let her walk all over him. He would find a way to rebuild, even if it meant doing it without her. But first, he needed to make sure she understood one thing. The consequences of betrayal were never as simple as she thought. Matthew had always been the kind of man who believed in loyalty, in standing by his partner through thick and thin. He had spent 10 years building a life with Claire, one filled with shared dreams, love, and the promise of a future together. But everything he thought he knew had crumbled in an instant. Claire's confession had torn his world apart, and now, in the aftermath, Matthew found himself standing at a crossroads. He could leave, as she seemed to want, or he could do something far more dangerous. He could make her see the consequences of her actions. The anger that simmered within him was cold, calculated. He had been the patient one, the understanding one, the man who had never doubted Claire's word. But now, he had no patience left. He needed her to feel the weight of what she had done. And he wasn't going to do it passively. Matthew wasn't about to just walk away quietly, as Claire had clearly assumed he would. No, this would be on his terms. He began his silent campaign of vengeance. It wasn't just about confrontation, it was about control. He started documenting every detail of Claire's life. Her phone calls, her late nights, her secretive messages. He installed cameras around the house, capturing the moments when Claire thought she was alone, when she was in the midst of her betrayal. It wasn't enough for Matthew to simply know the truth. He needed her to see it, to understand the depths of the damage she had caused. He would make her regret every decision. One weekend, after Claire had returned from yet another affair-laden night, Matthew did something unexpected. He went out and bought her a beautiful set of lingerie, a set so elegant, so luxurious that it could easily have been a token of affection from a devoted husband. But Matthew wasn't feeling affectionate. He had no love left for the woman who had so carelessly shattered their lives. No, he was using her. He was setting her up for the next stage of his plan. When Claire returned home that evening, he presented her with the gift, watching her as she opened it, her face lighting up with genuine excitement. But Matthew saw it for what it was, an act, a performance. Claire, once so beautiful in his eyes, had become a mere pawn in his game. She took the lingerie with a smile, oblivious to the fact that she was walking straight into his trap. He helped her into it, his hands steady as he adjusted the delicate fabric. Claire, unaware of the storm brewing inside him, pranced around the room, posing like a model, twirling and admiring herself in the mirror. Matthew didn't react. He simply watched, his heart cold and empty. The woman he had once adored had become a stranger, and this was the final performance. The next night, when Claire prepared for another girls' night, Matthew felt a sense of finality wash over him. He was done. He had seen enough, and he was ready for what came next. He watched her leave the house, slipping out the door with a hurried kiss and a brief smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She got into her car and drove off, and Matthew followed. He kept a safe distance, careful not to let her see him. He knew where she was going. He had already confirmed it. The man, her lover, was waiting for her. As Claire's car pulled into the parking lot of a hotel, Matthew's heart hammered in his chest. It was the final confirmation, the evidence he needed. He sat in his own car, watching from a distance as she stepped out of the car, her body language shifting as she met the man at the entrance. The betrayal was suffocating, but Matthew stayed calm. He didn't react. He simply watched, knowing that this was the last time he would ever let Claire control him. He had the power now. The following week, Matthew was ready. He had everything in place. The cameras, the footage, the proof of Claire's betrayal. He was armed with everything he needed to finally confront her. He had taken control of the narrative, and he was going to make her see the consequences of her actions. When Claire returned home late that night, clearly intoxicated, Matthew was already waiting. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. As soon as she stepped through the door, her eyes wide with surprise, he handed her a folder. Claire glanced at the folder, her expression unreadable. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. Matthew's gaze was unwavering. "You think I didn't know?" he said coldly. "You're no longer the woman I married. You're just someone I need to get out of my life." The words hit Claire like a slap to the face. She froze, her face draining of color as she slowly began to process what Matthew was saying. With trembling hands, she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the images and videos that Matthew had collected, footage of her late-night rendezvous, her secret phone calls, the lies she had fed him for months. The truth was staring her in the face, undeniable, unforgiving. She turned to him, her voice a mixture of disbelief and panic. "Matthew, please, this isn't what you think." But Matthew didn't flinch. He didn't show any emotion. "It's exactly what I think, Claire," he replied, his voice devoid of feeling. "You've broken everything. You've broken me, and now you have to live with that." The realization slowly dawned on her. Her face crumpled in shock, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. But Matthew didn't feel any sympathy for her. He had already made his peace. The marriage was over, but now, it wasn't just her decision anymore. As Claire packed her things in a daze, Matthew sat quietly in the living room, the sound of their children's laughter drifting from the other room. He had made the hard choice, the one that had been forced on him by betrayal. But it didn't make it any easier. He could feel the pain of it, the loss, the anger, the regret, but he didn't let it control him. Claire, now fully aware of the depths of her betrayal, couldn't look him in the eye as she grabbed her things. There were no more excuses, no more justifications. Matthew had taken control of his life again, and Claire was left to face the reality of her choices. The house that had once been their home now felt hollow, empty of everything except the ghosts of what had once been. Matthew knew that the pain of betrayal would stay with him for a long time. But he also knew that sometimes, in order to survive the wreckage of a shattered marriage, you had to take control, even if it meant watching it all burn to the ground. As Claire walked out the door, leaving behind the life they had built, Matthew sat in silence, his heart heavy, but his mind clear. The illusion had ended. Thank you for listening. If you were in Matthew's shoes, what would you do? Would you confront the truth head-on, or would you try to salvage the relationship? At what point did you begin to see the cracks in the marriage? Was it the late nights, the sudden detachment, or the subtle signs that something was wrong? Sometimes, the hardest part of betrayal isn't just uncovering the truth, but deciding how to move forward.